Hello students, we will be discussing the sociological perspective, chapter 1 of James Henslin's Essentials of Sociology, a down-to-earth approach, 13th edition. At the beginning of each PowerPoint slide, you will see that there are the learning objectives for each chapter. We're going to go into the history of sociology, going back into the early theorists, talking about how it developed in North America, and also to go over the major theoretical perspectives, explaining why a lot of people think that what we talk about is common sense, but we do use the scientific method, and we will be talking about that as well. This chapter also covers research methods, which go along with theory, knowing the elements of the scientific method, some different specific topics, gender in particular, in sociological research. We're going to talk about why it is vital for sociologists to protect the people that we study. We do study human beings, and so therefore there is a code of ethics that we must follow whenever we're doing sociological research. And we will also explain how research versus reform and globalization are really influential in sociology today. But first, let's talk about the sociological perspective. This perspective is really important, and I'm trying to understand why it is important, why we study this subject. It provides a different way of looking at familiar things, and it allows us to gain a new vision of social life, sort of putting on, a new set of glasses to kind of look at the world in a different way. How would our society look? How would our world look from an outsider's perspective? The sociological perspective is an approach to understanding human behavior by placing it within the broader social context. And so we look beyond our small corner of the world, our little circle of friends and family and community, and we look beyond that and see what it is like to walk in someone else's shoes. C. Wright Mills is an American sociologist, and he is well known for developing this sociological imagination. He referred to the sociological perspective as the intersection of our biography, the individual, and history, the social factors that influence the individual. So history is our location in a broad stream of events. In other words, if we look at the roles of men and women in society, if we look at how they've changed over time, that would be this stream of events that have resulted in those changing relationships. The biography is an individual's specific experiences. These are not what we call biological determinants. These are external forces, like our neighborhoods in which we grew up in, your social location in society, that is your experiences. They become a part of the way we think and what motivates us. It's this, sociological imagination. So we stress this broader social context of behavior by looking at an individual's location in society. How are people influenced by society? People who share a specific culture, people who share, live in a particular territory. There's some things they have in common. They also, operate within a specific social location, what jobs they hold, the educational level of one, what is, their age, their income, gender, and race and ethnicity. All these external influences impact our experiences and becomes a part of that broad social context. We're able to see the links between what people do and the social settings that sort of shape our behaviors. This perspective also enables us to analyze and understand both the forces that contribute to the emergence and growth of what we call a global village. globalization, and how we have far-reaching experiences through technology and the internet. Our unique experiences in our own small corner of the world is one part of this huge global village, where the way we buy our clothes, how we can communicate through FaceTime and the internet instantly with people, and see the different trends and styles and music, and that sort of is far-reaching. So we have become a very global village. We need to keep that in mind. Let's talk about the origins of sociology. How did sociology develop? So the first thing you want to think about is what led to sociology's development. So we're setting the stage here for the birth of sociology. And the social upheaval that existed in Europe as a result of the Industrial Revolution, which resulted in many changes, masses of people moving to the central cities in search of work. People really starting to question, difficult questions and trying to find out the answers to these questions about, life. And tradition really couldn't address those particular questions. So people began to look for these answers. Then we also had political revolutions here in America and also in France. The French Revolution, the upheavals of those conditions, those revolutions, encouraged people to really start to rethink their ideas about social life. More democratic forms of government were starting to develop. There was also the development of imperialism. Now, imperialism is a process by which a strong country gains control economically, politically, culturally over a weaker nation or a region. So as the Europeans began to conquer other nations, they came in contact with other cultures, with different ways of doing things, and they began to ask why these cultures varied. Then we also have around the same time the success of the natural sciences, things like astronomy and biology and chemistry and physics. These sciences were really applying the scientific method in order to find answers for the questions being raised about the social world. So science requires the use of theory, and so social sciences really started to explore this idea: history, psychology, economics, anthropology, and of course included in that is sociology. So the first theorist we're going to talk about is Auguste Comte. And Auguste Comte is known as our father of sociology. He's a French sociologist, and he's credited as our founder. He really began to examine and analyze the basics of social order. And again, this is around the time of the French Revolution, so his thinking, the French Revolution is really impacting his way of thinking and his ideas. He had questions about the social world, and so he decided to apply the scientific method to it and suggested the use of what is called positivism, applying the scientific approach to our social world. What holds society together? Why is there not constant chaos? What is keeping us together? What causes societies to change? He also coined the term sociology, which is the study of society. And although he did not practice this approach, he believed this new science should not only discover sociological principles, but should then apply these principles to social reform. Next, we have Herbert Spencer and social Darwinism. Now, Herbert Spencer grew up in England. He is known as sort of our second founder of sociology, and he disagreed with Comte's ideas that sociologists really should guide social reform. This would interfere, he thought, with the natural processes. So he viewed society as evolutionary. And so he's thinking around the same time as Charles Darwin. And we all know Charles Darwin is well known for survival of the fittest and that evolutionary approach, thus where we get social Darwinism as sort of this kind of idea brought on by Herbert Spencer. So he believed that, societies are evolving, and they're evolving from what he considered to be lower forms to higher forms. The higher, the fittest survive, while the less capable die out. Spencer believed that no one should really interfere with this evolutionary approach to society. So this approach was very, very popular among the members of the upper classes. And he's actually the one who coined that phrase, survival of the fittest, although Charles Darwin gets much of the credit for that. Next, we have one of our early thinkers, Karl Marx. And he's most well known for his concept of class conflict, conflict theory, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Karl Marx influenced sociology, but he did not consider himself a sociologist. Like Comte, he thought people should try to change society. So through revolution, he thought that that's what was necessary. We needed to see change. He got thrown out of Germany. Unfortunately, he settled in England. Just some background. He believed that class conflict is the key to human history, and that society is made up of two classes: the bourgeoisie, or the capitalists, the owners of the means of production, and the proletariat. The proletariat are the exploited workers. So he was looking at that exploitation of workers, the proletariat, by the capitalists or the bourgeoisie. Eventually, he said the workers would unite, revolt against the owners, which would result in sort of a utopia, he thought, this classless society. He believed people will work according to their ability and receive goods and services according to their needs. It's a quote from Marx and Engels in 1848. Marxism doesn't necessarily equal communism, but it's sometimes a term that's used interchangeably. He did not feel he developed it. Marx did not develop communism, although a lot of his ideas were applied to the thought. He did influence and introduce conflict theory, which is one of our major theoretical perspectives, which we will get to. Next, we have Emile Durkheim, and Durkheim was a French sociologist, contributed to many, many important concepts in sociology. He played an important role, and one of his goals was to get sociology recognized as a separate discipline. And he achieved this in 1887 at the University of Bordeaux when he was awarded his first academic appointment. His second goal was to show how social factors influence individual behavior. And he studied suicide and suicide rates in several European countries. And found that social integration, how integrated, the degree to which people are tied to their social groups, would affect and influence a person's likelihood to commit suicide. He looked at gender, male versus females, religious affiliation, marital status, if you were married versus if you were single, your religious affiliation, if you were Protestant versus being Catholic or Jewish. Now, this study was conducted over 100 years ago, and he did find that social integration, the lack of social integration that people have in society, would put them more at risk to commit suicide, and being a key factor in suicide likelihood. And his key findings still hold true today. His theory has both what we call explanatory power and predictive power, which leads to his third concern. That social research be practical. He feels that sociologists should not only diagnose a social problem, but we need to develop solutions for them. So again, as I mentioned, he wanted to get sociology recognized as a discipline. He studied how social forces affect our behavior, and he also identified that key role of social integration, the degree to which people are tied to their social group, identifying that key role of social integration. And his theory has such profound power, explanatory and predictive, that he could explain a particular social circumstance and also predict who would be at risk of a certain social condition. And here we have a table of comparing suicide of Americans aged 18 to 24 by race. And so you can see, I don't know if you could see beyond my picture there, but we see the large percent of males, majority males over females that are likely, which is something that Emil Durkheim found, is that males are more likely to commit suicide than females. If you are married, you are less likely. Singles have a higher rate of suicide as well. And also with religious affiliation, the more religious, the higher degree of religiosity someone has, the less likely they may be to commit suicide. And next we have Max Weber. It's spelled W-E-B-E-R, but it's pronounced Weber with a V. He's one of the most influential of all sociologists, raising some real controversial issues, even today, like religion and the origin of capitalism. Now, he disagreed with Karl Marx. Weber defined religion as the central force to social change, whereas Marx focused on social class. He says that Protestantism is what encourages greater economic development and was the central factor in the rise of capitalism in some countries. He theorized that the Roman Catholic belief encouraged followers to hold on to more traditional ways of life, while Protestantism embraced change. Protestants, particularly followers of John Calvin, sought signs that they were in God's will. They would know that they were saved until Judgment Day. So, what does this mean? Financial success became a major sign for people. The more money that they made, the more secure they were about their religious standing, and therefore they would work really hard in this so that the payoff would be greater in the next world. So we call this the Protestant ethic, the Protestant work ethic. So here we see the religion and the origin of capitalism, where he disagreed with Marx's claim that religion was more of the central force in social change. Thus we have his idea. He called this behavior the Protestant ethic, and he called their readiness to invest that capital in order to make more money, the spirit of capitalism. Also, Weber used cross-cultural, historical materials to find the causes of social change and how different social groups affect people's orientations to life. So it's motivated, by a lot of sociological thought too. And next, we're going to move into some more modern thinkers, discuss sexism, racism, and some other more modern theorists, North American theorists as well. So I should mention that the first departments of sociology in the U.S. were at the University of Kansas in 1890. But the University of Chicago is where quite a few sociologists do come out of. In 1892, we also find sociologists in Atlanta University very early on. Canada's first was at McGill University. Albion Small was the founder of the Department of Sociology at University of Chicago. He also established the American Journal of Sociology, which is where a lot of articles are published, a lot of research articles. The Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago dominated North American sociology very early on. So a lot of, again, the early theorists have come out of the University of Chicago. Robert Park, Ernest Burgess, George Herbert Mead, among others. It didn't escape the fact that sexism did exist amongst women in early sociology. In the early years, in the 1800s, the field was dominated by men because we had those rigidly defined social roles that prevented most women from pursuing an education. They had to be very wealthy in order for women to be afforded an education. Women were supposed to devote themselves to church and cooking and children and clothes, the 4Ks in German. Early female sociologists viewed sociology as a means to social reform, to improve society. So our early female sociologists looked to improve society, stop lynchings that they saw, and integrate immigrants into society, help the poor, and improve working conditions, even for children. Children were exploited at an early age. But men again dominated the early years. At the same time, we do have a few women that were from wealthy families and did manage to get an education, and a few even studied sociology. So we do have early sociologists that were female, and we're going to mention a few here. But sexism in the universities did prevent them from earning advanced degrees, becoming professors, or even having their research recognized. So a lot of their writings or their research went unrecognized very early on. Now here we have Harriet Martineau, and she was very interested in social reform and turned to sociology, where she discovered Comte's writings. She studied social life in both Great Britain and in the US, publishing Society in America. Most of her writing was done hidden beneath her sewing, on her lap. Again, it's not very feminine to be, writing. Sewing was feminine. Masculine, it was an idea that writing was a masculine behavior. So she hid her work. Her original research was largely ignored, and she's most well known for her having translated Comte's works from French into English. She advocated for the abolition of slavery. She's known to have traveled widely and, again, wrote extensively analysis of social life. Next, we have Jane Addams. Jane Addams is an example of a sociologist who was able to combine the role of being a sociologist with that of being a social reformer. She attended Women's Medical College of Philadelphia. So she came from wealth and privilege, able to get an education, eventually became ill and had to drop out. But she is a member of the ASA from its very founding in 1905, the ASA being the American Sociological Association. In 1889, she co-founded Hull House, Hull, Hull House for Immigrants. This is she co-founded it with Ellen Gates Starr. This is located in Chicago, and this was a settlement house. It was a settlement house for the poor, for sick, aged immigrants who were coming into the U.S. who were seeking refuge. Many sociologists out of the University of Chicago would assist and help and volunteer at Hull House. She also was the co-founder of the American Civil Liberties Union. She worked to bridge the gap between the powerful and the powerless. She also worked towards suffrage. She worked towards, which is, of course, women's rights, the right to vote. She was very active in changing child labor laws. She campaigned for the 8-hour workday. Her work earned her a Nobel Prize in 1931. So leader of the peace movement in World War II era. So very, very influential sociologist. And you'll see this, these are some of our forgotten sociologists. Alice Paul, suffragette, Ida Wells Barnett, a well-known sociologist as well, fought for women's rights as well as the abolition of slavery. So again, you want to think about some of the women who were not very recognized in their time, but did work tirelessly for women's rights. Which leads us to W.E.B. Du Bois and racism. So we have sexism and racism in our history. W.E.B. Du Bois was an African-American professional who also faced many problems. Spent his lifetime studying relations between African-Americans and whites. He was the first African-American to earn a PhD from Harvard University. He had earned a BA from Fisk University. He conducted extensive research in race relations, publishing one book every year on the subject between 1896 and 1914. Well, one of his well-known works is the Philadelphia Negro, written in 1899. He did this while at the University of Pennsylvania. So he went house to house, actually conducting personal interviews, knocking on doors, in Philadelphia. He combined data that he collected with census data to analyze the social and economic conditions of African Americans in Philadelphia. In fact, there's a church, and outside that church there was one of the mural arts program. There's a big mural of our sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois that is presented out there. Yes, it's a 6th and South at the mural arts program memorializes him. That was done in 2008. The African Methodist Church down at 6th and South. So, in that area, he had gone near that church. He studied, religion as well. He used quantitative science. Another piece of work that he wrote was The Souls of Black Folk in 1903. Excuse me. So, again, using graphs and statistics to quantify much of his research, acknowledging a strained relationship with the African American community in Philadelphia. He was not very welcome. Imagine he's knocking on doors, going door to door, knocking on, asking for the householder, the head of household, to ask an interview and ask questions of. So he wasn't really welcomed. Despite his many accomplishments, he encountered prejudice and discrimination in both his professional and personal life. Whenever he attended a conference with the American Sociological Association, he was not permitted to eat or stay in the same hotels as many of the white sociologists. Very frustrated he became, the lack of improvement in race relations. So he turned to social action. He is a co-founder he is one of the founders of the NAACP, along with Jane Addams and Florence Kelley and others from Hull House. Now, until recently, his contributions were much overlooked. And so he became very dismayed. At one point, actually, even just a little bit of background, his passport was taken away because there were people in community that didn't want him traveling and spreading his ideas to other parts of the world. And it did get returned to him, but he did end up moving to Ghana, where he is actually laid to rest. He continued to battle racism. He studied urban life. He studied the religious life. And he's really well known for a concept called double consciousness. So we see this concept called double consciousness where He describes what it is like to be Black, or what it is like to be African American in a white society, sort of living a double life. He also, again, studying the relationships between, whites and African Americans. Now we have Talcott Parsons and, again, C. Wright Mills, who I've mentioned already. Many of our sociologists from North America combined the role of being a sociologist with that of being a social reformer. Again, the University of Chicago sociologists Park and Burgess, they studied human ecology. There's a human ecology theory. So they studied many urban problems and offering suggestions on how to alleviate those problems. But by the 1940s, sociologists became more concerned with establishing sociology as an academic discipline. So the emphasis sort of shifted from social reform to social theory. Talcott Parsons developed abstract models to show how the parts of society kind of harmoniously work, how they're structured, and how they function together. So when we talk about functionalist perspective, we'll talk more about Talcott Parsons. Then we also have C. Wright Mills, who urged he wanted sociologists to get back to social reform. He saw the emergence of what he referred to as the power elite as sort of a threat to our freedom. Top leaders in business, this elite group who are elite in terms of business, politics, and also the military. His ideas became really popular after the 1960s and 70s. Again, a lot of social activism happening around that time. And as I mentioned earlier, he's most well known for developing the sociological imagination, how we see our world through a broader lens, as an outsider would. What would an outsider think about the way we do things, how we behave, how we think, what are our values, those sorts of things. So he's a very controversial figure, and this is his book, The Power Elite, especially because of this analysis of the role the power elite has in society. So it's taken for granted by many sociologists and members of the public, this idea of there being a power elite that runs our country. Now, there is this debate, this tension that exists in society, in sociology, about what should be the proper goals for sociological analysis. Society, analyzing society versus reforming society. So there's this continuous tension and struggle today. So in order to understand it, I just want to briefly go over the different types of sociology. We have basic sociology, which is pure sociology, where we analyze some aspect of society with really no goal other than obtaining knowledge. Okay, so the goal is really just developing that thought. Then we have applied sociology, which exists between the two extremes of analyzing society and reforming society. So this is an attempt to go beyond our basic society. And one of the first attempts at applied sociology is when we founded the NAACP was founded, sort of implementing solutions to certain problems. Today, applied sociologists work in a variety of settings, from business, high-tech organizations, government, not-for-profit agencies. I would have to say the work that I had done when I was full-time working as a research associate to be applied sociology, where I used my background and experience in sociology within my work. I worked at Cooper Hospital in Camden, and in the planning department, and helping implement different strategies within the organization. So that's really a way of giving an example, a real-life example of applied sociology. So it's the application of sociological knowledge in some specific setting, rather than an attempt to really rebuild society. Now, in an effort to pursue a social reform agenda, we have the ISA is now promoting what we call public sociology, where the goal is to influence politicians, public officials, and policymakers, sort of make recommendations using that. So it's sort of a compromise between basic and applied. Clinical sociology is another field that many people think about and talk about getting into. These clinical sociologists often work with family therapists. They might, talk on helplines to help teens and adolescents. So it's really a way to help improve or change relationships in people's lives. So that would be a clinical sociologist, although that's not listed here. Social reform is really risky. It's really a disruption. There's a disrupting the status quo, and that can be really challenging. But when things are not right and things are not just, disrupting that status quo might be the necessary thing to do. And so, that's where the extremes come in, and we do see some positive social change result. And here we have a nice figure, figure 1-3, really kind of outlining of the continuum of, one end of the spectrum being basic sociology to applied sociology, and public sociology being in the middle, and who the audience might be in those circumstances. Now that we know who the major theorists are, the early thinkers, the next thing we're going to talk about are what the major theoretical perspectives are. Central to the study of sociology or any science is the development of theory. A theory is a general statement about how parts of the world fit together, how they relate to one another and affect each other. So we use in sociology 3 major theories: symbolic interactionism or interactionist theory, functional analysis or functionalist perspective, conflict theory. These theories are used to help us to observe and interpret the different social context, relationships, and the realities in very distinct ways. The first theory we'll talk about is symbolic interactionism. And symbolic interactionism views symbols, things to which we attach meaning, as the basis of social life. So these symbols are the basis of social life, how people use these symbols in everyday life. Charles Horton Cooley, but also George Herbert Mead developed this perspective. George Herbert Mead developed the book. His lectures were combined together his students combined his lectures into a book entitled Mind, Self, and Society. So how people use these symbols in everyday life? Well, through the use of symbols, people are able to define their relationships, to coordinate their actions with others, to make social life possible. Having the shared meaning of what these symbols are, shared understanding of what the symbols mean. It enables us to develop a sense of ourselves. So, for example, if we see someone with a wedding band on their hand, that symbolizes marriage between 2 people, and so we understand what that meaning is, that represents. Symbolic interactionists will study face-to-face interactions and small group interactions, families, friendship networks, gangs even. So we study these, how people sort of make sense out of their life in these everyday interaction using these symbols and what their place is in society. So what we're going to do is apply the symbolic interactionist perspective onto the study of divorce. And so a symbolic interactionist studying divorce would focus on how this changes the meaning of marriage, how this changes the meaning of family, how it changes and affects the meaning of divorce, the meaning of parenthood, the meaning of love, and how that's changed in society. The meaning of marriage once was viewed as an obligation or a duty. The couple would vow, to one another, but love was not always necessary. It was not a prerequisite, so to speak, in marriage. By the 1930s, young Americans changed that view, and so, William Ogburn, another social scientist, in 1933 observed that people were placing more of an emphasis on love and personality and chemistry. And by 1945, Ernest Burgess and Harvey Locke reported that people expected affection and understanding and compatibility, those sorts of, feelings. Feelings began to grow in importance. Duty and obligation became less important. So marriage can be broken much more easily when feelings change. Now, in the meaning of divorce, we've seen as divorce becomes more accepted, there's a decline or decrease in the stigma that was once attached to divorce. It's no longer a symbol of failure. In fact, it represents for some, new freedom, new beginnings. And so we've seen that change in the meaning of divorce over time. And also the meaning of parenthood. Parenting used to mainly involve, providing food and shelter and clothing and moral guidance to children. But children have, at one point were contributing to the survival of the family and the support of the family very early on. In industrialized societies, we start to assume that children are a little bit more vulnerable. They need our protection. They're depending on their parents for financial support, emotional support. And so we're seeing that change as well in parenthood. So that support really extends even into adulthood, as we see as we study the family. Also see a change in the meaning of love, views of love as a symbol. If we only rely on true love for the main reason for marriage, we may often become very disappointed. It weakens the marriage because expectations are, maybe up here and then it not be what the reality is for many people. So, love ebbs and flows and peaks and valleys, and so to rely on love as the sole purpose for marriage is not what many people think is meaningful, because love is very fleeting. It can be very fleeting. Let's take a look at some real data on marriage and divorce in the United States. And so if we take a look at this graph. This is a line graph depicting changes in U.S. marriage and divorce rates over time, starting from 1890 all the way. It's projected beyond 2020. So I just want to point a couple things out where we see this peak in marriages right before the 1920s and 30s. What's going on at this time period? The Great Depression. Then we see a decline in marriage, but an increase in divorce here right around the 1940s and 50s. And we know what was going on around this time is World War II, right? And then here we see another dip in the marriage, sort of a leveling off of the divorces going in through the 1960s and 1970s. People are postponing marriage. They're not getting married. This was the time of this, the 60s, all, the sit-ins and love-ins and peace and, the feminist movement. So we see, definite changes. We want to look and consider, what's going on in our history when we see these trends in the marriage rates and divorce rates. And then as we look here in the projections, we start to see, again, marriages are starting to dip down, but there's been a plateau in the number of divorces. Well, as people postpone the age of first marriage, people are a little bit older when they get married, and when they wait longer to get married, those marriages tend to be more stable, and so they're not as likely to end in divorce. And so there may be fewer marriages, but those marriages are long lasting, and that's some of what the studies are showing in the sociology of the family. In this next table, we see Western marriage and what we talked about in terms of historical highs and lows and contemporary highs and lows. So where historically we saw high emphasis on duty and obligation and less of an emphasis on feelings. In more contemporary marriages, relationships between a husband and a wife in particular, we see high emphasis on feelings and less of an emphasis on duty and obligation. The next major theoretical perspective we're going to talk about is the functionalist perspective or functional analysis. And this is the idea that society is made up of interrelated parts that work together. It's also known as the functionalist perspective, functionalism, even structural functionalism, because these parts, how they're structured and how they function as this whole unit made up of these interrelated parts that work together. Comte and Spencer, our early thinkers, viewed society as a living organism. And just like a living organism has different parts that need to work together, they're structured in a certain way that need to work together for our human bodies to run smoothly. All parts need to work and function together. Well, Durkheim, he viewed society as well as being made up of parts, each with its own function. So in order to understand society, we need to look both at the structure, how the parts fit together to make up the whole, and the function, how each part contributes to society. Now we have also Robert Merton here. As you see, he used the term function to view the benefit of people's actions. Functions help keep a group stable. So functionalists are all about maintaining stability in society, having a stable society, a stable social system. Dysfunctions will create instability in society. And functions there are two types of functions. There are manifest functions and we have latent functions. Well, manifest functions are things that have intended consequences, while latent functions have unintended consequences. So I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to use the education system. Going to school. When we go to get an education, there's a manifest function. It's to learn. There is, this manifest function. We know that we're going to get an education. There is something that we are going to school to learn. A teacher will be there to teach us, and we will be, the learners that will take in that education. That's a manifest function. An intended consequence of the educational system is to pass on that learning and that education. The latent function is that you're going to there's a possibility you might meet someone, make friends. You have something in common. That's an unintended consequence. Many of us have, friends from, our early childhood, years in elementary school. Think back, to when you went to school. You made friends, hopefully, and, maybe even later years, in our older years in high school, and even now as we, are in college and taking college classes. That's an unintended consequence. It's a latent function of the educational system, is that we will meet people, a friend, a spouse, a partner. Now, a dysfunction, if we were to think about, a dysfunction and unintended consequences or dysfunction to an education is underage drinking that might take place on college campuses. That would be an underage, binge drinking, that sort of thing. Underage students might end up at a party where there are older students who are drinking, and that is a dysfunction. It creates an instability in that person's, in those students' lives. Now, if we apply functional analysis, going back to the example about marriage that we talked about, marriage and divorce, when we talked about symbolic interactionism, try to explain divorce from a functionalist perspective. And you can see maybe it's just a different way of looking at a similar issue. Functionalists would look at how industrialization or urbanization both contributed to the changing function of the family, of marriage and the family. So, for example, prior to industrialization, families worked together as an economic unit, an economic team. Wives and daughters did household tasks, and husbands and sons, maintained farms and maintained the crops and the tools and the animals on the farm. Divorce was low because families needed to work together for survival, out of economic necessity. So there's a function for those roles within the family. Education, religion, leisure, recreation, all caring for the sick and the elderly. These were all functions of the family. As these functions have shifted away from, or outside of the family, its members no longer need each other for survival. So we've seen, an increase in, women in the workforce. Means they don't need to rely on a spouse or men for financial stability. So we look at the way things are structured and function in the way we approach any particular issue when we're studying it from a functionalist perspective. How does the larger societal influences impact, people, individuals? It's from a macro perspective. And we'll talk about the difference between micro and macro. But symbolic interactionists we just talked about are the micro perspective, functionalist our macro perspective level of analysis. And here we have the conflict theory or conflict perspective, another macro level of analysis. From the conflict perspective, society is viewed as being composed of groups competing for scarce resources. Karl Marx, the founder of conflict theory, witnessed the Industrial Revolution in Europe, and he saw farmers leaving the land to work in the cities, and they could not make enough to eat. So Marx's focus was on the conflict or the struggles between those capitalists or the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production, and the proletariat, the exploited workers. So you have a small group of capitalists and a large group of exploited workers, exploited by those capitalists. Proletariat work long hours, minimal wages, in deplorable conditions. Contemporary conflict theories, the conflict theory today, has expanded this perspective to include other sources of conflict, relationships with people in power and authority. Anytime you see, someone with power over others in relationships, we see that conflict. Small groups, organizations, communities. So in, parents and children, teachers, police officers, with others. We see racial inequality. Contemporary theorists will examine racial inequality. Feminists we're going to talk a minute about gender inequality and also those class differences as well. According to sociologist Louis Koser, C-O-S-E-R, conflict is most common among those who are in close relationships. An employer-employee relationship, in the intimate relationships, parents and children, spouses, those sort of become, sources of conflict sometimes. And so the contemporary conflict theorists would examine that, what is influencing people to be in those sort of conflict relationships. Now, feminists and conflict theory, feminist is very closely connected to the conflict perspective. So just like Karl Marx stressed conflict between capitalists and workers, feminists stress similar conflict between men and women. They're not looking at it from that everyday face-to-face interaction. They're looking at it from a larger perspective. This is another macro level perspective. So we're examining, feminists are here examining the historical, contemporary, and global inequalities of men and women. The women's rights movement, for example, shows that dominance by men can be overcome. Fighting for that social change can ultimately result in some positive social change. Now, if we were to apply conflict theory to that example we were talking about with marriage and divorce, how would a conflict theorist look at that? So divorce in a conflict perspective is seen as the outcome of how that balance of power is shifting in the family. So as women have gained more power, they're no longer, by working outside of the home, they're no longer dependent on men or their spouse. They have resisted. Men have ultimately, whenever there's this change, there will be resistance to that change, and so men have resisted to those changes. And women have made progress, and there's still room for that progress to be made. Now, if a woman is unhappy and she does have the ability to support herself, she has the option of not staying in an unhappy marriage because she's solely dependent on her spouse. So women can support themselves. And so a conflict perspective would look at that divorce and marriage and how the meaning of that has changed in terms of conflict and power. So each of these perspectives, if we want to think about it, how each perspective sort of provides a different and often contrasting picture of the world. So each approach provides a lens. It focuses on different features that might lead to a distinct interpretation of that particular issue. No one theory is correct. As sociologists, we often use a combination, which gives us a combination of these theories, which gives us a much more comprehensive look or picture of social life. We often use all three. We may lean towards one or the other. I tend to lean towards the symbolic interactionist perspective. That's one of my favorite theories, although any one is still something that I'd be interested in considering, and if that doesn't help with the particular issue I'm studying, feminist theory might make more sense, or conflict theory. And so we need to really give us a complete picture and look at the combination of all theories. Now, as I've been mentioning, as we've been talking about these different theories, we look at things from a level of analysis. The perspectives differ on their level of analysis. So, for example, the functionalists and conflict theorists are the macro level. Even feminist theory is a macro level approach. They look at large-scale phenomenon. What's going on in the economy, for example? We're seeing today, as we are going through this experience of this pandemic, how is something that's health related affecting so many people in the world impacting the economy, and vice versa, and then the economy in turn is affecting so many people. So that's a macro way of examining this particular issue. Symbolic interactionist is looking at the micro level, the small scale patterns, what's going on at the face-to-face, everyday small group interaction, peers, families, the use of symbols at that small scale level. So here, again, another example in addition to the coronavirus. But if we look at your author is very interested in homeless people. So from an interactionist perspective, they would study the daily life, the daily, everyday, face-to-face interactions of the homeless. The people in shelters. What are they doing in terms of homeless now in the time of this coronavirus? How are we getting them off the streets? Are there homeless shelters that will take in homeless at this time? So they would look at those communication patterns, who's going out, what outreach is taking place to get those homeless into these shelters. From a functionalist, and a conflict perspective, they would really study the parts of society that have resulted in the increase in homelessness. What's going on in society. Decrease in jobs, outsourcing, high unemployment rates, change in skills required for particular jobs that maybe those individuals were not able to obtain, which left them unemployed and thus not able to afford housing. Maybe there's a change in their family structure, that class structure is also affecting, the local job market, housing market, lack of affordable housing. So these are large-scale, more macro-level phenomena that have impacted individuals, resulting in the number of homeless on the streets. So you see the difference in those two side-by-side examples. What's nice, and what you'll see in every of these PowerPoint slides, and even throughout in your chapter, table 1.1 here will give you a summary of the theoretical perspectives, the level of analysis, the focus of analysis, some of the key terms I've mentioned. So if you're doing 3x5 cards, this is a nice place to kind of pull that information together and help with your study and trying to really keep these theories straight in your mind. Now, theories need to be tested, and this requires research. Research findings need to be explained, which requires theory. So research and theory, they go hand in hand, which is why this one chapter has both concepts included in one chapter. So there's a lot. This is a pretty detailed first chapter. So both theory and research are essential for our study of sociology. Sociologists combine research and theory in many different ways. Theory is used to interpret data. Functionalists, conflict interactionists provide frameworks for interpreting our research findings. And research helps generate theory. And C. Wright Mills argued this connection between theory and research. Often people make assumptions based on common sense, everyone knows that. Everyone knows, women talk, are chattier than men. So it must be true. But as a sociologist, we do not take something like that for granted just because everyone knows it. Each fact, what we study, must be tested, and it must be tested scientifically. Common sense is often based on limited knowledge. Research will confirm or deny the validity and extent to which is considered to be true, what makes sense. It's not just because it makes sense or just because everyone knows it. We need to study it to be sure that it's true. Before I get into the research model, I just want to mention that culture has a significant impact on what one believes to be true. So it needs to be much more objective. We need, that's why we call this a social science. Sociological research allows us to move beyond that common sense and understand what is really going on. So we get to the bottom of it by going through the scientific method. Henslin, your author, identifies these 8 steps in the scientific research model. We select a topic, and a lot of topics are, selected from a variety of sources. Something you're interested in, something you read in a book, something you heard in the news. We define the problem. We develop a research question around that problem. You get a little bit more specific. Topics are very broad, so we need to narrow it down to a specific research question. We want to review the literature. What has been studied in this particular area, where are the gaps, helps refine our problem. We need to formulate a hypothesis, something testable. We also, need to choose a research method. What is the design? What is our, plan of collecting data, which is the next step. We collect the data. We analyze the results. And then the last step in the process is to share those results. And it's sort of cyclical. Goes around. So the end of this particular research is the start of the next level of research. So it's the beginning and an end when we draw our conclusions. Here we go. That's that cycle. So if you go through each of the steps, selecting the topic, defining the problem, reviewing the literature, formulating a hypothesis, choosing a research method. We will discuss what those methods are. You collect your data, analyze your results, share the results, and you develop your conclusions, and it stimulates more ideas for further research. Things always need to be examined, maybe in a new, innovative way, maybe in a different part of the world, in a different part of the country. So these, research typically generates additional hypotheses. So anytime you're reading a research article, that's part of what's written in the conclusion. Well, if I had more time, I could look at this. I could look at this problem this way. And so there's always that striving for, asking more questions and finding out more about a particular topic. Okay, so let's go through some of these steps. Selecting the topic. This topic is typically guided by our curiosity, our sociological curiosity and interest. Are we interested in a particular topic? Have we had certain experiences in our life that kind of drives us to want to learn more about something? Your author was interested in homelessness, and so that drove him to want to learn more about the homeless population. Another thing that could drive a topic is funding. If sometimes, government agency or a private source is available to send, to apply for a grant on a particular area of study. Researchers will apply for that funding. Funding is integral in being able to develop some of these research projects. There may be a pressing social issue. When we see a lot of social movements develop, Black Lives Matter movement, the feminist movement, all these movements that kind of, are around a particular social issue. We tend to focus on research around those topics. And again, like I mentioned, a personal experience that you may have that you want to learn something more about. It drives you to want to, examine something further. Defining the problem is where we specify what exactly do we want to learn. What is that research question? Topics, again, as I mentioned, are very broad, so we need to identify specifically what is it about the topic you want to know. And it's usually defined in terms of this question, and questions can take a lot, to draft up. It's not a specific, couple words. How are the homeless making it in the streets? So it might have taken the author quite some time to kind of really come down to that particular question. He wanted to learn what is their life like on the streets, and so developing that question, kind of narrows down what he will focus on with a broader topic like homelessness. We also want to review the literature. This helps us really refine that problem. We may uncover literature that already exists about the problem. It may be dated and we want to update it. We may find gaps in the literature, areas that need to be researched within this particular topic. And it also provides us with additional ideas about what questions we might want to ask. The next step is formulating hypothesis. A hypothesis is a statement of what you expect to find according to predictions from a theory. I don't know if you could see the little graphic here, but usually have variables. Independent variable influences change in the dependent variable. My video is kind of covering that up there. So it predicts a relationship between those variables. Variables are factors that change or vary from one person or situation to another. Some examples of what variables are things like race, gender, age, income, education. These are all variables. So for example, we want to hypothesize that the higher your level of education, the more likely you will have a higher income. So is there a relationship between your level of education and your income level? So we need to operationalize these variables. And an operational definition is a way to measure these variables. How do we measure education? Something very abstract. There are different ways to ask somebody about their education. What is your highest, educational level? What degree have you obtained? How many years of schooling do you have? So you can say 12 years. You can say I have a high school diploma. You can say I have, more than a high school diploma. Maybe you have some college. So there are different ways to kind of, narrow down. Maybe you want to know what the person's educational knowledge is. They're based on their IQ test. Or standardized tests that will measure a person's knowledge base. So you see there's some different ways, and we need to be clear on how we're operationalizing our variables. Same thing with income. It could be personal income, personal individual income. It could be household income. And so we need to, if we're talking about dollars, yearly, how much a person makes in a year. And so we need to really be clear on how we measure the variables. Again, it's measuring something that may be abstract, like education, like health. Challenge you to think about something. How do you measure health? What measures can we use to measure a person's health? Okay, is it enough to say I'm healthy? Or do we have to take some kind of measures to determine what does healthy individual look like? So operationalize education, income, wealth, childhood well-being, health. So these are all variables that kind of are connected. So we want to see, again, does that independent variable that influences a change in the dependent variable? Okay, the next step is choosing a research method. How will we collect our data? Which method? Which design? What is our plan to collect the data? So it's typically influenced by the research topic. The questions need to be, what question needs to be answered? Is there funding issues? Do we have enough money to maybe do a participant observation? Or do we need to rely on secondary sources? Or do we have enough money to do interviews? In-person interviews versus a mail-out survey. So we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about what those methods are. Once we've decided that method and we've collected data, that's the next step. Collecting that data, we need to ensure that it's valid and reliable. Validity, does that operational definition measure what we intended it to measure? What is the well-being of a child? How do we measure that? Bullying, if we're looking at bullying, how are we measuring that? How are we operating? Is it valid? Is it a reliable measure of bullying? We have verbal bullying, physical bullying, cyberbullying today. We need to be sure that it's valid. Does it measure what we intended it to measure? If we're measuring someone's age, and we ask, women don't like to be asked what their age is. So if we ask a woman her age and she says, well, I'm 25, but her birthday is March of 1967, that may not, make sense It may not be a valid indication of that person's age. Reliability. Are we producing consistent, dependable results? Can we replicate these results? Durkheim's study of suicide was was explanatory and predictable. People have replicated his study and have come up with similar findings. And so we need to make sure it's consistent, make sure we have reliable, valid data. Inadequate operational definitions can hurt our reliability, can really hurt. And if we don't come up with a good sampling design, that can also hurt our reliability and validity. Excuse me. The second to last step is analyzing these results. And this involves the use of either qualitative or quantitative techniques in order to analyze our data. So this is where we're testing our hypothesis. Except in participant observation and case studies where there's really no hypothesis. We're really learning about that setting and trying to find those trends to develop a hypothesis. But computers have really come a long way and are very useful in data analysis. There are programs like SPSS, which is the statistical package for the social sciences, which allows us to crunch large data sets and generate findings. So we can reduce large amounts of data to these really basic patterns, which is what we're trying to find in human behavior. That allows us to use a variety of tests, regression, sophisticated as regression analyses, but we can also, look at descriptive statistics, general trends in the data. So it gives us it's a lot of time to really interpret the results. After we've analyzed our data, we want to share that data. We want to develop our conclusion, wrap up that research. How we did the research, how we operationalized our variables. We need to illustrate, include any tables or charts that help to, make any numbers, data we have visually attractive in terms of how a person reading our article will find the findings. We want to maybe compare our findings with other published reports. Does it support or disagree with other theories? And determine that need for further research, as I mentioned. So again, the conclusion is an end, but it's also a beginning. Here's a list of our different research methods or research designs. So we're going to talk about each of these individually. So just a list: surveys, participant observation or field work. We're going to look at case studies, secondary data analysis, analysis of documents, experiments, and unobtrusive measures. The first thing we're going to talk about are surveys. Surveys involve collecting data by having people answer a series of questions. Now, it's not as easy as it sounds. Something I have some experience with, developing surveys, developing the questions in the surveys. So before you even get to, as you're thinking about designing that questionnaire or survey, you also need to think about how are you going to select a sample. Ideally, we'd like to ask every person in our population, but sometimes that's, populations are way too large. So we need to get a representative sample. So we determine the population, that target group that we want to study. And then we want to select a sample from that population. These are individuals within that target population who are intended to represent the population. So we want a representative sample. The best way to get that is representative, or a sample that we can generalize from, is to select a random sample. And random samples are those where everyone in that population has an equally likely chance of being selected into our study. Some examples are probability samples. We have non-probability samples, snowball samples or convenience samples, cluster samples, purposeful samples, systematic sampling where we select every 5th person, every 10th person. So there are a variety of ways to select it, and there's a lot of random number generators. There's random tables in books. So the ideal, though, is to be able to say you've given everyone, randomly selected the people into your study from the population, so that you can generalize your results. Stratified random samples are another. This is a sample within specific subgroups of your target population. So if you're studying college students, you want to stratify those students between the freshmen, the sophomores, juniors, and seniors. And so you select 100, freshmen, 100, randomly select 100 freshmen, randomly select 100 sophomores, randomly select 100 juniors, randomly select 100 seniors. So you're stratifying that sample across those different groups. Makes sense? Wish I were in person to answer these questions. Okay, so each subject is assigned a number. We don't generally, we don't really, we want to protect anyone's confidentiality, we want to protect their identity, so we assigned a number so that, again, that random number generator can help us select, especially from large populations. The other thing we want to make sure we're doing is we're asking neutral questions. After selecting our sample, we need to design that questionnaire, and those questions need to be neutral. So it allows the respondents, the people who are asking the questions, to express their opinions. And we want those opinions not to be influenced or biased by anyone. So here's an example. And you can hear the difference in the way this question is phrased, which is why, writing questions is really serious business. We need to make sure that we're asking, a question that everyone either understands, or that we're not, introducing any bias. Don't you think that men who beat their wives should go to prison? That's one way of asking this question. And then the other way, that's the biased way. The non-biased way would be, what do you think should happen to men who beat or are abusive to their wives? Do you hear the difference? Okay, in one way we're implying that what we think should happen to them. And then the other way, we're really asking the person to really think about what is their thoughts? What do they think should happen? And that's what we really want to do. We want to make sure the question is written clearly enough so that everyone we ask is going to give that non-biased opinion. Now, questions can be administered. Questionnaires can be administered either by asking the respondents to complete a survey themselves, which is called a self-administered survey, or you can ask respondents directly by interviews. But we can do it through the mail. We can do phone interviews, and now even we have computers to assist us with administering surveys. There are also issues, with each of those methods. If you mail out a survey, you may not get a survey mailed back to you. If you do a phone interview, people tend not to either pick up the phone, or they may not have a phone, or they might hang up on you. If you do a computer-generated one, maybe people who don't have computers aren't able to be included in your study as well. So those are all issues that we need to consider when we're doing the survey. The researcher must consider, again, the bias, interviewer bias that affects that interview has on the answers to those questions. We also need to consider open-ended questions versus closed-ended questions, which I have an example with on the next slide. But an open-ended question is where we give people the opportunity to answer the question in their own words. So it's open-ended, and I'm going to show you an example of that. And a closed-ended question is where we're giving the respondent specific responses to select from. So it could be strongly agree, don't agree, strongly disagree. And so, or it's a yes or no, don't know, where we're actually asking, and we have already pre-designed the response categories. It's important. Last thing is to establish a rapport, especially if you're interviewing. Establish a rapport with the respondent, with the subjects of study. If we don't, especially the subject may not be open and honest, and we really want the respondent to be as open and honest as possible. People are not always very comfortable, especially sensitive questions. So that, in that case, if it's a lot of sensitive questions, and maybe a pencil paper type of survey might be the better option. But developing a report is really key, especially when you're asking sensitive questions, or building up to those sensitive questions. Ask more generalized questions before you ask the more sensitive ones. Any way you can offer the respondent some more privacy and confidentiality, you want to ensure that can help you with building that rapport. Another thing about surveys is that they're pretty cost effective. There's little money to reach a lot of people, and that's our goal, is we want to reach as many people as we possibly can. So oftentimes you'll see people motivate respondents to turn back their surveys if it's a mail-in survey. They might offer gift cards, or even put some money. I've gotten surveys from the government, from the Census Bureau, where they've actually put a $5 bill inside the envelope, saying, pay me for the time it would take to complete a specific survey, which kind of motivates, well, they've given me this, and let me take the time and send the survey back. And usually it really didn't take a lot of time. It's pretty, they had it really designed really well so that it went rather quickly. So they're really going to try to motivate, especially marketing surveys. But research surveys are really driving a lot of data and a lot of importance. We have a census coming up in April, so hopefully, a lot of you are going to be motivated to want to, send those surveys back in. And if the first survey isn't sent out, they often send up a follow-up one. A lot of, the census will do that. They'll send a second one, a third one maybe. I think after a certain number, though, they'll send somebody out to your house to do a face-to-face interview. So they're really on top of getting people to send back those census surveys. And we get a lot of secondary data from those sources. Okay. So here we, just to review, we're going to, ask the questions. We're going to see if it's, do we decide, is it going to be a closed-ended question or an open-ended question? Maybe we don't know exactly what we want those closed-ended categories to be, so we leave the question open-ended to really explore what the respondent has to say. Getting to the answers, are we going to interview, or are we going to send out a questionnaire? And administering it in person, through the mail. You can reach a lot of households if you send it out in the mail, but then you may not have a higher response rate. So anytime, you've got to really decide on what avenue you're going to administer the survey. So here we have, again, an example between a closed-ended question, A. Which of the following best fits your idea of what should be done to someone who has been convicted of spouse abuse? So that example I gave a little bit earlier. So instead of biasing the question, this is somebody who may have done some research in this area and knows that these are some of the options, and so they've already loaded this the options, giving the respondent some options to select from. In the closed-ended question. On the other hand, what if you don't know what those options could be? You would ask an open-ended question. What do you think should be done to someone who has been convicted of spouse abuse? And then that person can give their opinion on whatever they think would be, and that's how we can maybe take those open-ended responses and kind of categorize them and see what are the common themes that we're finding when we ask that question. So they're very valuable one way or the other to use these different types of questions. Participant observation, or fieldwork we call it, is where a researcher participates in the setting while observing what is happening in that setting. A dilemma is often faced here is how involved should you get? in the lives. I've given a couple examples here. The Adlers, Peter and Patty Adler, did a study on cutting behavior where they were studying self-injurious behavior, and they did in-depth studies online. They were getting involved in chat rooms and with 30 to 40,000 internet posts on this, and they found that it was really more of a coping mechanism rather than anything else, not suicidal intent. And but how far would they go in terms of participation if someone they felt was in danger? And so that's really where ethics can kind of come into play. Some of you may have read this. I know some English teachers are giving this out as an article, but Barbara Ehrenreich's Nickel and Dimed on not getting by in America, where she went under, Barbara Ehrenreich went undercover working for minimum wage to see, could you make it on minimum wage? She worked in Key West, Florida as a waitress. Then she went to Portland, where she was a maid and a dietary aide. Again, and she also went to Minnesota where she worked in a Walmart. So she really mapped out and went basically like a journalist undercover, not revealing her sources, changed the names of people that she worked with, and found it very, very challenging to do that. So she really immersed herself in the different environments. And that's what you do when you are doing a participant observation. This last example is William White's ethnography called Street Corner Society. It's a classic study. William White was a Harvard sociologist, and he lived 4 years in an Italian community in Boston. This was published in 1943, so it's definitely a classic. It was a slum neighborhood, whereas lower class street gangs where the boys hang on the corner. It took him, a long time to really gain the trust of the leader, the leader of that street gang. He became close with that leader, Doc, and won the trust to be able to stay there and hang out with him. I think he even he moved in with a family in the neighborhood, spent 18 months living with an Italian family in that community. So basically you're uprooting your life. It's very, very time consuming. And so a lot can be pretty much involved when you do a participant observation, as opposed to just an ordinary observation where you might be just observing an environment where it's known that you are, really observing. You're not participating in, but you are just taking field notes and jotting down what is going on, how people are interacting. And so I have an example of that where I was observing in when I worked at Cooper Hospital for a number of years, and as a graduate student, I was studying trauma, injury, and looking at the trauma intensive care unit, because Cooper is a level 1 trauma center. And I wanted to know, how do doctors and nurses, what are the relationships between the doctors and the nurses? And so I observed. I had to don scrubs. I had to put scrubs on, and I got all the proper legal, paperwork that allowed me to enter the trauma intensive care unit, to stay back and not be intrusive, and just watch the interactions between the doctors and the nurses and how they, interacted, even in and around patients. I was very concerned. Doctors tend to bark orders at nurses, but when you feel, when you know those are high intense situations, that's one of the reasons. I went on rounds with them, observed the interactions, and there's a lot of impersonality that kind of takes place under high, intense, stressful situations, as I imagine is probably going on quite a bit under the circumstances we are in today with the coronavirus. So it's about saving lives and about getting the job done, and then when there's time afterwards, that's when the personality could become prevalent. Generalizability is a problem when you do a participant observation. These findings applied to that particular setting at that particular time, so they're very exploratory. My observation, took place in that particular time in that ICU unit at that time with those particular patients and those doctors and those nurses. It may not be the same if I were to do it again, or it may be. That's the issue, is how generalizable are these results. And that's why Barbara Ehrenreich went to so many different states to kind of see how she could live in those different locations. Can she generalize her findings? Now, results of participant observation really stimulate hypotheses and theories that can be tested in other ways and using other types of research. Case studies are another thing. The question of generalizability is raised as well. This is where a researcher kind of focuses on a single event, a single situation, or an individual. There are a couple of examples of this. The one I want to mention for time is Jeannie Wiley, the case study of a young girl who was locked in a bedroom for so many, was from the time she was 20 months. They didn't find her until she was 13 years old. So that's a case study, where you would not necessarily lock a child in a bedroom to see what would happen as an experiment. But as a particular case study, this happened, unfortunately, to this young woman. And so, what can we learn from that case? And then take it from there. So it's an attempt to understand, the relationships, the power thinking that motivates people. So you record a great deal of detailed information about the situation, but the question again remains, can we generalize? Secondary data analysis is another method, the analysis of data collected for some other purpose that is used for our research. And this is used when resources are very limited and our existing data may provide excellent sources of information. Because the data was collected for another purpose, we can't be sure that the questions that we want answered are going to be addressed. So we need to, be careful about that. Was there bias? Was there a record accuracy in collecting the data? And what systematic gathering took place. So here are some of the examples. We have census data, again, which is widely used. Health statistics, crime data. Crime data is generally tricky because some crimes do go unreported, but with that in mind, we can still analyze some of that data. General social survey gives a lot of opinion type attitudes and opinion questions. National longitudinal survey of youth, which is a study a database I looked into when I was studying teen pregnancy. It tracks not only tracked teen moms, it tracked their children and over time. And so you got a very robust data set where you're tracking people over time, long periods of time. So a wide variety of data sources that we could, and actually it's much more easily accessible today than it was back when I was a graduate student. Another thing we can use are other documents, recorded sources like books and newspapers and diaries and bank records and police reports, immigration files and records that are kept by organizations. Anything that's public information, recorded sources we're able to gain access to, as long as we're not violating any privacy, HIPAA regulations. We could, Facebook, social media is another avenue of like looking at different things, people's diaries, and letters, love letters, and video recordings, audio recordings, again, and now is another source of information to study. I get some valuable research out of that. Now, experiments are useful in determining, again, causal relationships. And in this table, we see, we mostly study humans, so we have human subjects. And so we would randomly assign them, our human subjects, into either an experimental group or a control group, expose the experimental group to the independent variable, and then see, not expose the control group, and see, what do we find, what influence was there. So that's what experiments involve: independent variables that cause a change in something, and dependent variables that are changed. Sociologists use this, probably the least. The goal is, again, ethically, we want to protect our respondents or our subjects. Humans are our subject, so we make an oath to do them no harm. So, we have examples of experiments where, experiments have been, conducted. We've got the Stanley Milgram experiment. We administered the electric shocks. We'll talk about that. And also the Stanford prison experiment, where, students were randomly assigned as prisoners or prison guards, and the ethics and came about as a result of those types of experiments. We have the last we're going to talk about are unobtrusive measures, and again, some ethical implications to this. These are ways to kind of observe people that they're not aware that we are observing them. So we need to, again, be careful about ethics. We have security cameras everywhere. People have, cell phones, and our ability to take pictures and video, and in the palm of their hand. Stores track our purchases, social media, and so forth. So we have a lot of means in which to collect a lot of data, and that people are not aware that it's being collected on them. But we need to abide by the ethics in our research. To record behavior of people in public settings, like if people are in a crowd, going to the mall, you cannot do this without letting them know. The privacy versus the public setting is key. So if you record their behavior, like in a crowd, without announcing that you're doing so, is okay because it's public, they're in a public arena. But if you're doing this in a private setting, in their home, not acceptable. In the dressing room of a store, as opposed to in the main mall, which is a public area. Unacceptable if it's in privacy of a dressing room versus out in the main store or in the mall. It's unethical to watch someone who may be in harm's way as well. Here are some examples of some unobtrusive measures. You can count the number of beer bottles in a trash can of a dry town. This is research that has been done, which is why these examples are here. So you can see, it's unobtrusive. It's put out in the trash. It's public. It's not unless it's on person's private property, you wouldn't be able to touch it. You can watch and count the number of people that go in and out of the shopping mall. There's no private connected information that you're collecting. You're just counting people. This last one's, checking the radio stations on cars being serviced to determine whether or not, that music is the preference of the person driving that car. Again, unobtrusive. You're not bothering the person. You're not collecting any personal identifying information. You're just checking what radio station is appearing on the car. Okay? Now, because gender can be a significant factor in social research, researchers take steps to prevent it from biasing their findings. They may split the interviewers in half. Half of the interviews are conducted by male. Half of the interviews are conducted by female. Gender can also be an obstacle to doing research, especially when the topic is a sensitive one and the gender of the researcher is different than the respondent. Men or women may be less likely to open up to someone of the opposite gender. And finally, there are questions about the degree to which the findings from a sample made up only of one gender can be generalized to the other. So if you ask, got predominantly male respondents, can you generalize the male answers to the females? Now ethics. We talked about, in a couple of examples, we need to abide by a code of ethics in sociological research. And this is a fundamental concern to us, to sociologists, when it comes to doing research. It's a 30-page document, so we don't have 30 pages here, but we do have a nice list of the types of things that we consider. It was originally written in 1971. It was, a couple of revisions, 1997 and 1999. So the American Sociological Association provides this to us, the ethics in research. And so our guidelines require us to be open and honest with our findings, with our design, our interviewing with, being honest with our subjects. We need to share our findings, whatever they may be, even if they don't, they'll go against what our hypothesis was. We need to share what we found. It forbids us from falsifying any results, prohibiting plagiarism as well. That we need to make sure that we give credit where credit is due. We acknowledge any funding sources, who provided the funding for us to conduct our research. Declare authorship. Who did you collaborate with? You want to make sure you acknowledge those individuals. You want to make sure you obtain informed consent. There are documents for that to be obtained. We ensure confidentiality. We're kind of like a journalist, protecting our sources, and we do not misrepresent ourselves. If we are who we say we are, we need to be sure we're clear in that instance as well. Here are just a couple of examples in abiding by these ethics. The first is an example of protecting subjects. Mario Barahua was a graduate student at SUNY conducting a participant observation of restaurant workers. And there was a suspicious fire that burned down the restaurant. Yet he refused to turn over his field notes. He was subpoenaed by both the courts, but he was also being threatened by those under investigation, who were under investigation for setting the fire. So he was in a predicament, and so he did, protect the subjects. Another example is where you mislead the subjects. You don't want to do this either, and this is in the Humphreys research. Laud Humphreys was an Episcopal priest conducting a participant observation, again as a PhD student at Washington University. He was observing tea rooms, and tea rooms are public restrooms where men go for encounters with other men. He obtained the men's addresses from their license plates parked in front of these locations, and then went to interview them under a disguise to find out about their personal lives. He told them he was doing a medical study, which again, so he's misleading his subjects. Again, a very sensitive topic that maybe they would not have been open to discuss, but you don't mislead someone just to get a research study done. So there are some ethical issues that are raised, protecting someone's privacy, their rights of privacy, and keeping their information confidential. The way he went about it was inappropriate. All right, the last thing we're going to finish up with here is something that I mentioned briefly in the beginning of this lecture. I don't know if, it's about this tension between research and reform in sociology. To understand the tension, sociologists have really divided sociology into these three phases. So phase one is where, the primary concern was to, make the world a better place. And then we moved into phase two, which is from the 1920s to World War II. And this phase is where sociologists wanted to establish sociology as a respected field of knowledge, emphasizing basic or pure sociology. And then phase three is the current phase that we're in since World War II. And this is where there's been an attempt to sort of merge that sociological knowledge with the development of more applied sociology. And so that's where we are now in the ASA and in the type of research that's being conducted. Despite identifying these three phases, each is characterized by a different position by sociologists who either are on the side of reform versus analysis. Now, as the world becomes more global, globally connected, American sociology will likely expand its horizons. So we're really thinking, about broadening our horizons. So globalization is another trend, a second major trend, in addition to, the tensions that are going on. We're seeing the breakdown of those national boundaries because of advances in communication and trade and travel. So globalization is likely to continue to broaden the scope of our sociological analysis. So we're looking beyond those boundaries. It's globalization. We're considering, again, more global issues. Viewing other cultures. What are their likes? What are their dislikes? Looking at various trends in clothing and textiles and music and foods and things like that, things of that nature. The financial markets, what's going on in different financial markets. Global warming and the environment, how is that impacting, that issue. So globalization is one of the most significant events in world history. To take it to even a more current event, what's going on globally in terms of this pandemic. It's spread across the world, and now we're dealing with it in our nation, in our communities, in our homes, which is why we are online right now. So we will be, again, discussing a lot of the issues that come up throughout sociology in the next 7 weeks in terms of globalization in our lives today and how that has impacted us.